I'm watching one horror movie every day of October. If you've already seen the other videos, you probably already know the deal, so let's go ahead and get started with week 3. Today I watched Phantasm. This is a 1979 movie about a boy and his older brother investigating strange occurrences at a cemetery. For the first 30 minutes of it, I wasn't really into this movie. It didn't really seem to be going anywhere, the acting was kind of shoddy, and I was about to write it off as something that wasn't for me. But then the movie kicked into high gear and completely hooked me. From that point on, it was a wild ride. This is such an exciting movie that's jam-packed with so much weirdness and creativity. This is a movie that has everything. Supernatural elements, slasher elements, gore, great practical effects, a few tense action scenes, and even some fantasy elements. It's a movie with really great atmosphere, which is greatly helped by its fantastic soundtrack. I can see why this movie has a cult following. This movie is by no means perfect, but it sure is a lot of fun, and I'm glad I checked it out. I highly recommend it. Today I watched Scream. At this point, this is a modern horror classic, and honestly, the last great slasher movie. Since this movie came out back in the 90s, the genre of the slasher has basically died out. Although on the other hand, it did kind of start an entirely new genre. Movies like Deadpool owe a lot to this movie in the way it incorporates meta-commentary of its own genre. The difference between something like Deadpool and this movie, though, is that the meta-commentary isn't so in your face. There's no one breaking the fourth wall to crack a joke at the audience. The meta-commentary tends to be a lot more clever than that in Scream. It's a movie that commentates on slashers while also being a great slasher movie. The mystery story here is pretty great, with clever twists and red herrings to keep you on your toes. The dialogue is also really smart and entertaining, even if it is a bit hammy at times. For me personally, this movie is significant though, because it was the first slasher movie I ever really liked. After I watched John Carpenter's Halloween, I thought I didn't like slasher movies, but then I saw this, and it, along with some other slasher movies that I watched, made me realize that it's not that I don't like slasher movies, it's just that I don't like John Carpenter's Halloween. And I know that's a controversial opinion, and maybe one day I'll explain why I dislike that movie, but for now I'll say that it was just a bad first slasher movie for me, and Scream saved me from becoming a hater of the slasher genre. So yeah, I think this movie is pretty great. Today I watched Dracula. Now, there's a million different Dracula movies, but this one is the 1991 movie by Francis Ford Coppola. It's a beautiful film with elaborate production, costumes, and makeup. It's got a star-studded cast with Anthony Hopkins, Gary Oldman, and Keanu Reeves, and it's directed by the guy who made The Godfather. So I've got to like this movie, right? Wrong. I hated watching this, and I couldn't wait for it to be over. To be fair, it's not entirely the movie's fault, I just hate the kind of movie this is trying to be, especially when I went in expecting something that at least vaguely resembled a horror movie. But no, this is actually a Victorian period piece that's more of a romance story. I guess this is something I could get behind, but everything in the movie is so melodramatic and campy that it's hard to take anything seriously. To me, this feels like a big-budget soap opera that just so happens to feature a vampire. In order for me to like a Dracula movie, it really needs to lean into the fact that he is a monster in a horror movie. This is not that at all. This is a movie about a real estate deal that leads to some guy falling in love with a woman who looks just like his dead wife. I'd talk more about the filmmaking here, but it was hard for me to focus on that and engage with it on a deeper level when I hated the very core of what the movie was trying to do. I know some people really like this one, but it just was not for me. Today I watched The Hills Have Eyes, directed by Wes Craven. After rewatching Scream and Nightmare on Elm Street, I decided to check out an earlier film by Wes Craven, and I'm glad I did because I really liked this one. The direction here is great, as expected from someone as revered as Wes Craven. The setting of these rocky desert mountains are framed in a creepy way that does make it seem like danger could lurk behind every stone. This movie takes its time building up suspense. It hides the villains of the movie for about half the runtime, slowly building up the tension until it finally explodes in scenes of grisly and shocking violence. When these villains do appear, however, they look really great. The makeup and costumes looked really good in this movie. Michael Berryman didn't even need makeup to fit the role, and he did a great job performing. All of the tension is backed up by a great score that really keeps you on edge. I also thought that the screenplay, which was written by Craven as well, was pretty good. My main issue with it would be that this is not as well paced as Craven's later work. There's lots of meandering in the first half of this movie, and I could see that boring some people. Unlike Elm Street, this movie is not one scare after another. It also doesn't have the tight construction of a movie like Scream, and because of that, it isn't as consistently engaging. I can also see the villains in this movie coming off as silly today, but personally, I thought that the performances were good enough that they were still effectively intimidating. I definitely recommend this one. Today I rewatched Shaun of the Dead. I'm not huge into zombie movies, it's actually one of my least favorite subgenres of horror, but Shaun of the Dead is one of the few zombie movies I actually really like. And that's in large part due to the fact that it's directed by one of my favorite directors ever, Edgar Wright. This was his debut film, and I think it serves as a sort of blueprint for his later work. A great example of what I'm talking about is how the fight in the bar being synced to a Queen song ended up morphing into the entire concept for Baby Driver, where every scene is synced to a song. The screenplay in this movie is fantastic. The characters, story, and dialogue are all great. It's a really funny comedy, and at the same time, it's a serious story about people who are struggling with letting go of the past and dealing with where their lives have taken them. I don't know why you wouldn't have seen this movie already, considering how popular it is, but if you somehow haven't, I highly recommend watching it. Today, I also rewatched Alien. I've seen this movie several times, but what I loved the most this time around were its visuals. The sets are breathtaking. And even though this movie drags for me narratively during the first 20 minutes, the visuals keep me completely arrested. Once John Hurt gets attacked by the facehugger though, this movie is just non-stop thrills, and even after rewatching it so many times, this movie still sets me on edge. It's 40 years old, and it has not only stood the test of time, but it's passed it with flying colors. This movie could be released today and it would get zero complaints. Not that you need me to tell you any of this, because this film is legendary, obviously, but I just think it is a marvel. Today I watched Inferno. This is directed by Dario Argento, who is best known for Suspiria, a movie that's relevant here because Inferno is actually a companion film to Suspiria. It's a spiritual sequel to Suspiria that deals with the same kind of witchcraft. My favorite thing about Argento movies are the visuals. The way he uses and blends colors is beautiful and mesmerizing. It's a visual style that you can tell was really influential on a lot of directors today, especially ones like Nicholas Winding Refn. Just like most of his other movies, this also has a really good soundtrack full of rock instrumentals. When you combine all of these sensory elements with the surreal happenings of the film, it's a movie that feels like a really weird nightmare. However, I didn't like this one as much as Suspiria and Deep Red, and I think that's because for a long time the story just didn't seem to be going anywhere. Basically, it boils down to the movie doing the same thing over and over again until it finally decides to wrap up. The individual scenes are entertaining, but when they don't feel like they're leading to anything, it can get pretty dull. All that being said, if you enjoyed Suspiria and Deep Red, you'll probably like this too, and if you haven't seen an Argento film, I definitely recommend starting with Suspiria first, as Inferno is definitely not his strongest work. Today I watched The Void. This is a movie I've been wanting to see for a while. I heard it was a practical effects showcase as well as an homage to John Carpenter movies like The Thing, but it's actually more than that. I would say this movie is more of an homage to H.P. Lovecraft more than anything else. The story is very Lovecraftian as it deals with cults and beings from other dimensions, which if you're even vaguely familiar with his work will definitely sound like H.P. Lovecraft to you. The practical effects are definitely good, and it's just another movie that adds to the list of reasons why we should never abandon practical effects in favor of CGI. For everything that I appreciate about it on the surface though, the first hour of this movie is pretty bad. The screenplay could have been considerably better because a lot of the dialogue is awful. There's a lot of character conflict here that is contrived as hell. Characters would fight and argue with each other for no reason at all. Pointless arguments that led to nowhere were so frequent that it started to anger me after a while. Looking back on it, these were probably just there to pad out the movie's runtime. And the reason I say that is because the last 30 minutes of this movie are actually really good. It embraces the weirdness of its Lovecraftian influences and does a good job depicting the kind of tension and dread that's present in many of Lovecraft's stories. If more of the movie was like this, then I would probably really like it, but unfortunately the first hour is a bunch of poorly written bullshit. The writing in the first half is so bad that when it starts to come back around during the second half, it just kind of dampens the experience. I can see the direction of this story really blowing your mind if you've never read H.P. Lovecraft, but if you have read some of his work, then you pretty much know where this is going to go from the very beginning. That isn't to say that experiencing the journey to get to the destination isn't enjoyable, because aside from the first hour, it is, but it's definitely not up to par with the quality of the movie's inspirations. Overall, this movie is okay, bordering on good, and if it had a better script, it would be really good. Check this one out if you like weird science fiction horror or you're a fan of H.P. Lovecraft. That's it for week 3. Stay tuned for week 4, which will last from the 22nd to the 31st, and it may even include a review of The Lighthouse if I get a chance to see it. Until then, I'm Randall the Vandal, and thank you for watching.